IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. Mental illness is not something well understood in India, and specific disorders even less so. Besides, those suffering from such illnesses don't talk about it. Their families cover it up, and everyone silently suffers without any kind of medical diagnosis or help. Aparna Piramal Raje, after years of suffering from bipolar disorder, has now come out with a book, Chemical Khichdi, How I Hacked My Mental Health. It is a candid account of what she went through and how it affected those around her, and of course, how it affected her. But as she admits, in her case, she had a supporting family, understanding friends, and a lot of general social and medical support. Aparna comes from a very well-known business family and has been a CEO of a company, is a public speaker, and is a columnist, among other things, and now an author too of a second book. This book doesn't flinch from her own experience and has much to offer those who may also be going through similar symptoms. She joins us today to speak about her book and her own life experiences as she journeyed from somebody who felt the symptoms early on and then went through 20 odd years, 20 long years of coping with her bipolar disorder. Aparna Piramal Raje, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for doing this.
First of all, why did you write the book? And did you not feel inhibited to let it all come out into the open?
Well, why did I write? I wrote it because I think we all want to tell our stories. I think as a journalist, you would understand that how important it is just to kind of, they call it owning your truth these days. So, but just you can call it just telling your story. And I thought it would help others because I went through a period of a lot of ups and downs, but then I went through a period of stabilizing and recovering. And there were certain tools and techniques that I developed for myself that I thought could be useful for other people. So that was really the idea of the book. And about inhibition, I was quite familiar with this genre. I think this genre is not so popular in India, but I have read many memoirs in the West. I've grown up in the West also. So this was not such a new aspect of writing for me. I didn't feel that I was sharing so much that would really damage anyone. So I was actually okay with the sharing part, and then it's for people to respond the way they want to respond.
Yeah, in the West, people, especially in the United States, people do let it all hang out, as it were, and sharing is definitely part of it, but also, in a sense, a complete sense of honesty, of letting the world know. But as you said, in India, it is quite new. And we are, as a society, have been experts in hushing up things, haven't we? And especially inconvenient truths.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one sort of constituency I was worried about were my children. I did not want to do, anything that would make them feel vulnerable or even embarrassed. I have a teenage son, so you can imagine what it's like to be a teenager and to have your mother write a book about madness. So I think, I was careful about their interests really. And I spoke to a lot of people around that, but they were really the only people I was concerned about, to be honest.
So one of the things you do say candidly is privilege. And then you talk about privilege and you talk about stigma. Does privilege play a role in your experience? Even writing the book is a sense of, you have that power to write a book. You say that you did not face any stigma from family and friends. They were very, very supportive as soon as they knew, and even before that. But privilege is not, firstly, privilege is a big help, but privilege is no barrier to stigma, since wealthy families do hide family secrets, don't they?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just add one caveat. I mean, my friends and family were supportive, but at the same time, they weren't actually sure that I had I had it in me to write the book, right? That I could go back and revisit everything and stay calm and not get manic while writing the book. So it was actually a book club of mine that really encouraged me in that process, and a writing club that did that. So that's just a caveat. Coming back to the issue of privilege, see, I had the luxury of saying that, I didn't have a full-time employer who might get offended if I wrote this book. I write for the Mint, but I'm not a full-time employee with them or with the other institutions that I'm associated with. So I think a lot of people, particularly I imagine if you are holding a full-time job and you may or may not be in a position to talk about your mental health, regardless of whether you come from a privileged background or not. So I think I had those kind of luxuries of being able to be open. And I think when it comes to, some people have told me was that actually, a lot of wealthy families have more stake in the game because they don't want their reputations to be tarnished in any way. But to be honest, I never looked at myself in that way of saying that I had something to hide. It was more a question of just learning to live with it. I didn't see it as something that was necessarily such a big secret and such a negative aspect of my life. So I looked at it differently, perhaps, and that's why maybe sharing it became easier, regardless of where I'm from or which family I happen to be born into.
Aparna, was there any time before you were fully diagnosed when people must have said, even people close to you must have said, oh, it's one of her mood swings? People have mood swings. Sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're not. She's just a moody person, and without any kind of medical value attached to it. Did that happen?
So, Sidharth, there was a long period actually between the first incident, which when I was 24 in the year 2000, and the time that I got officially diagnosed, which was 13 years later. So I think that, during that time, it's not that we did not seek help. We were going to a psychotherapist and we were using talk therapy, and we were, as a family, quite skeptical of medication. So the point I'm trying to make is that during that time of 13 years, it was very much seen an aspect of my personality as opposed to medical condition that I'm living with. So I think that with mental health conditions, there's really a fine line between the personality and the illness, which is why I am, pro-diagnosis, because I think that helps to make that distinction. Because it was very difficult, people just assume that this is my personality. I would have these mood swings, as you said. I would go up and down, and the people weren't really sure why this was happening, what the triggers were, how to manage it. So there was a lot of kind of blind spots for all of us.
I mean, you said there were 13 years in between, which means people were, let's say, unaware or groping in the dark or didn't know about the medication or were skeptical about it. What exactly does the diagnosis entail, where somebody, a doctor, a qualified professional says, this is clearly a medical problem, clearly not just a psychological or personality disorder, but much more than that, and then looks at various parameters and then, gives medication? What exactly is that process?
So essentially, what happened was there were certain ups and downs that kept happening during this period from the time that I was, 24 to, let's say, in my mid to late 30s. But it reached a stage where I was actually psychotic at one point, where really my thoughts, emotions were not in my control. I was sleeping very little. I was just very energized, and actually there were voices in my head and hallucinations and delusions, which I probably still haven't shared today until the book came out. So I think that when it reached that stage, it was so obvious that I needed medication to tranquilize me and stabilize me that we had to go to a psychiatrist, and a family friend who was a doctor intervened and took me to one. So I think there are different circumstances that might get people to go to see a psychiatrist. But in my case, because there was really no other option, and it had reached a stage where I was not in control of myself. So that's what took us there. Yeah.
And how long did it take for the psychiatrist to fully diagnose what it was and then prescribe something? How long does the whole process take? I'm thinking in loudly. I'm asking this question for people who may be listening to this and might be wondering, at what stage do they or their families decide to take it one major step forward?
So it's not that I didn't have a diagnosis earlier. It's even earlier, there was a question about, is she bipolar? Is there a borderline? So the word bipolar was used even during those 13 years. It's just that when we went to see the psychiatrist, it happened pretty soon. Like, it was pretty clear, these are the symptoms, this is what's going on, and this is what's needed to medicate. So that was pretty kind of, as soon as we met the psychiatrist, within one meeting, it was pretty clear that this is the course of action and the treatment plan that needs to be followed. So, and then after that, I was in that person's care for quite some time. I think because of the person who introduced us to that psychiatrist, we had a lot of faith in this doctor, and Dr. Raman Deshpande was a family friend. And because we had a lot of faith in him, and we just felt that I needed the help, we found a psychiatrist that we liked, even though earlier I had seen psychiatrists and were not necessarily very happy with everyone. But this person seemed to be, very stable and seemed to be very robust. And so we felt in safe hands with him. But we got the diagnosis very quickly once we went to see him.
So can you give examples of your behavior? You said psychotic, or feeling happy and depressed on the same day, for example. You talk about even your experience in the ashram in Bihar, where you felt energized at one level and then, kind of very, very sad. That same thing happened at family gatherings. Can you give examples in detail about uncharacteristic behavior which left everyone mystified?
Yeah, so in my experience of being bipolar, and I think it pretty much complies to what I've heard from other people and from the textbook symptoms, is that first of all, I lose sleep. I'm very energized. I have lots of thoughts in my head all around trying to save the world. If I knew Sidharth Bhatia, then I'd probably drop him an email about all the things I could do to save him the world, something like that maybe. And I would just really make life quite difficult for the people around me, because I have so many energy, so much energy, so many ideas, so many thoughts. And my behavior changes, my body language, facial expressions, the eyes. My sister always tells me that look in your eyes is always telling about whether you're going through a manic phase or not, because there's so much intensity over there. And it's difficult. It's physically grueling, because you're keeping up, with a high pace of energy and very little sleep for days and maybe even weeks at one end. And then inevitably what happens is like this tornado that goes up, 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 and up. And, and then it just kind of crashes, and everything that you have planned in your head is nothing of that is happening. And I just end up feeling really depressed, and feel the sense of hopelessness and despair and sense of what am I doing with myself, and then I have to pick myself up from that depression and try and get back to my normal routine. And so that recovery phase also, I think, is a very important part of the whole condition. I think we associate bipolar with mania and with depression, but this whole recovery phase also takes a long time to kind of just get back into the routine and to find your feet again. So that's what one of these manic episodes and its aftermath is like.
One of the questions that I was trying to understand while reading your book, did you lose your temper during that high energy phase? Is bipolar behavior in conjunction with the essential personality of the person, or can be completely different? Like you could become a different person, or are you just more or less on the same lines, where somebody typically is on the same lines as they are in normal life?
I think a lot of my impulse comes from wanting to do something good in the world. And I think that does stem from my normal behavior, which is I do want to try and do something, good and positive in this world. So maybe those are linked, and maybe it's a sort of magnification of that. But I think certainly a lot of it is quite uncharacteristic, right? Of just taking more risks. Like I'm not talking just about myself, but a lot of other people have, going on sort of spending sprees and maybe trashing a restaurant, or so there are different expressions of what might happen. In my case, it's a lot of writing, which I do in any case, but it gets magnified. So I might write 50 pages in 5 days, for example, which, normally it would take me 3 hours to write 1,000 words. So I think that there are different expressions of it, and those expressions would be in tune with what people are doing, but the scale of it and the way they're behaving and there may be the thoughts are just quite irrational. Certainly a lot of what I've experienced has definitely been irrational compared to what I would think about on a daily basis. So that's, quite out of sync in terms of character. In terms of irritability, I think that I know that my family have told me that there have been times when I've been angry and irritable, but I am so consumed with the thoughts in my head that I honestly forget what it's like to interact with somebody when I'm in a manic or phase. So I guess there have been times when I must have been quite unpleasant, but I don't have a clear recollection of that.
You mean that you become a different person? You have no recollection?
No, I'm not saying that. I don't think I have become a different person. I have a clear recollection of my manic episodes, which is why I can, write the book and talk about what happened in all of these places. Not that you're like a different person in the sense that you are, it's not like you're showing there's a completely different person, which implies something closer to what I understand to be schizophrenia. It's not like that. It's different. That's my understanding of schizophrenia. It could be wrong. But it's more like you're just completely impulsive. You're acting on different triggers, and whatever you normally do gets magnified. That's my experience of it. Like I said, if I normally do a little bit of writing, I'll be doing a lot more of it. If I have certain ideas, they'll just be magnified a lot more. And so the scale of that makes it uncharacteristic, if you understand what I'm trying to say. It's not that the personality is completely disconnected, but it's just the way that I'm executing and acting on my ideas is totally different from what I would behave on a normal day.
So you could probably then, if I may just, be little lighthearted here, you could probably write a book in about 2 days or something, that kind of thing.
I've done the best I've done, I think, is 50 pages in 5 days, which is pretty good, I think.
Yeah. That 50 pages in 5 days is not something any of the professional writers can manage. But of course, it must have a tremendous impact on you, your family, your friends, your co-workers, maybe even strangers. And not everyone could have been so understanding.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, the thing is, it's also, the problem is, Sidharth, is that especially the hypomania stage, which is the stage before mania, is a very creative stage, and one can be quite productive at that time also. And that's what makes it difficult, because that's what makes it kind of, quite I don't like to use the word addictive or anything, that suggests a different condition, but it becomes it's a very attractive phase, right? There's a sense of excitement, a sense of creativity, a sense of being able to conquer the world, having a lot of these ideas, delusions of grandeur, and you're at the center of your universe. So all of these things are kind of make you feel really omnipotent. And that's not a bad feeling in itself. So it's hard to let go of that, fantasy, or hard to stop occupying that.
I read your book, Aparna, and you've got a chapter title which is very compelling. Mental health is a family sport, or something on those lines. So, and then you go on to talk about teamwork. Everyone, your mother-in-law, your husband, your kids, before you got married, your sister, your parents, everyone is very, very supportive. Surely in your immediate world, or the one step away from your immediate world, there must have been people who may not have been so supporting. I mean, it can't have been so comfortable and so reassuring. And I'm not provoking that thought to say, okay, tell us about those who were mean to you or whatever, but I'm saying that may not be available to people.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was very lucky with my caregivers. And that's why I say that mental health is a team sport, because they need each other also to look after me. Looking after me during those phases is just not that easy. And they, especially my mother, my sister, and my husband, they, three of them really relied on each other for many years. When I was going through these ups and downs, I would go to stay at my sister's house or at my mother's house while I recovered. And possibly that's one of the reasons why I've not had to be institutionalized. Maybe there were times when it could have happened. So I think that not everybody has this kind of setup, certainly. And the only ways around it is then to look for more like institutional alternatives, where in the case where you don't have separate homes that you can go to and stay for a week or 2 weeks at a time. And I think in terms of support, we definitely have had, a lot of support, but there've also been triggers in the family situation also, which I don't want to get into too much, but those have also been there as some of the reasons for the episodes. But I like to concentrate on the parts which have been very helpful to me.
The book itself is fairly honest and candid, but the thought that struck me was, you've already referred to it a minute or two ago, there were times when you were fine over several years at a stretch, and coincidentally, I felt that these were also stable times in your personal relationship. Your 2 years in London soon after you got married, for example, and often episodes came when you were stressed about personal matters, about or at work, when you were CEO of a company and you couldn't handle all the crises till your mother and sister intervened. Are these often connected, these triggers, that they set off moods or your mania, or it's just a coincidence?
No, I don't think there's any coincidence. I think that we all have triggers for stress in our life. The question is, how do those triggers then manifest themselves? And in my case, they manifest themselves in a disorder or a condition. For other people, you might be dealing with triggers or for stress related triggers through different routes, whether you could be, just using alcohol as a way of coping with it, or finding healthy ways of coping with it also. I think we all have stress in our lives. So I think the question is really about triggers. For me really lay in work-related stress, which goes back to my sense of identity, professional identity and personal identity, which was a very big part of my existence. And I talk a lot about that in the book. And then interpersonal conflict is another big trigger for me. So I think that these are big triggers for everyone. So it's just a question of how they, how they kind of fully take shape in a form which is manageable, or whether one can learn to cope with it. I think now also, it's not to say that there aren't things that trigger me, but I've just become a lot better and more self-aware and have much better coping mechanisms to deal with them.
So towards the end of the book, you quoting every member of your family who all gave their version of how they saw you and how they felt at the time. And I felt that your husband's observations were perhaps really extremely, shall I say, brutally honest in some places, where he said that he just wondered in the early years of the marriage what his life had become, where he felt that, and it must have been even worse because he was the one closest to the situation on a day-by-day basis, hour by hour. How did that then feed back into you, the way he must have reacted? There is always a sensitivity to what's happening in your immediate life.
Yeah, I think the relationship of the spouse is the one that is very important. And one of the most important feedbacks that I've got from people who read the book is that they appreciate that I've highlighted the role of the caregiver, because that's as important in any sort of medical condition, looking in any medical condition, and it's not highlighted enough in the Indian context. So for Amit, really, I think that there were different phases of his understanding of this condition. Initially, there was just bewilderment of what is actually going on, lack of understanding, then slowly an acceptance as a medical condition. Then this phase of, when they were happening repeatedly, he was sort of wondering what's actually going on. Then for us also, for me also, a challenge where, I'm in this situation where I'm the patient, he's the caregiver, he's almost like a policeman, he's monitoring my sleep, he's monitoring my meds. It's just not a great situation for anybody to be in. So, for our relationship to kind of transcend that and to be in a situation where we are more comfortable living with it as a couple, and that there's a feeling that we're on a little more solid ground. So I think we've been through all of that in the last 15, 17 years now.
Your children in the early days must have been in a state of bewilderment also, but now you quote your elder son, who's a proper teenager, who perhaps is going through his own issues, but he sounds like quite, shall I say, cool to say mom has these funny modes. And have they come to understand, accept, deal with it, or just, cope with it and say, okay, this is happening, but we know what to do?
Yeah. I think that the first thing I'll probably say about is my older one is that he's probably tired of hearing me talk about mental illness. Usually the interviews get recorded in the living room because that's where the setting is the best. So anyway, but I think in terms of both of them, see, the good thing, Sidharth, was actually that the first 4 years when the children were quite young, when they were born and they were young kids, I was actually very stable and I was a very hands-on mom. I was just doing a little bit of freelancing from home. And so I was spending a lot of time with them. And so they got a lot of stability, I would say, in their very initial years. Then there were these periods which were a little more up and down. And I also want to say, even this up and down, they're certain, like, they happen for a few weeks in a year. It's not like they're happening all the time. Most of the time there's normalcy, but there are these few weeks of the year where things get disrupted and I might be up or I might be down. But it's not like a permanent situation by any means. And now again, I think I've been in a good place for the last 4 years. So I think my younger one, Agastya, has much less of a recollection of, these funny modes, as they like to call it, because he was much younger. The older one is very perceptive. And even as young as 9, he would ask me questions like, why are you so silent today? And he can definitely see, even on my, sort of daily little ups and downs that happen, he can judge them very well, and he'll always comment about them. So I think there's no getting away from, hiding it. There's no getting away with the children knowing about it. If you think that you can have this kind of condition and the children not knowing about it, that would be quite a naive belief.
Yes, kids can be fairly perceptive. I wondered when I finished the book, is this book some kind of catharsis? Is this, would you call it a primer for people who may be bipolar and for their families? A self-help book? How would you characterize it? Is it all of that?
Well, I would say that some pieces of writing in the book, which are the poems and the journal entries, are quite cathartic. I wrote them at certain points of time when I was being quite emotional, and I think they capture those moods. I've been told quite well. A lot of the writing, though, is quite reflective, and I've tried to make it, analytical, and not to make it so cathartic. I was writing it while the lockdown was going on, and my older one and I were sharing a study. So I was listening to his classes while I was writing it. So I had to be quite focused and just focus on writing it and completing it. I think that, my main feeling after I've finished it is really honestly one of relief that I've been able to do it, because I've been wanting to do it for such a long time. So more than catharsis, I'd say just a sense of relief. And in terms of the audience, I think it can help anybody with a mental health condition. It doesn't have to be bipolar. It could be any of the conditions that we live with, because the therapies that I've talked about in the book that are there as a way for people to cope with their conditions are something fairly universal. The feedback that I've got from people who've read it already is that it can help actually anybody in everyday life who want to enhance their mental wellness, right? So if bipolar might affect 1% of the population, mental wellness is something that affects 100% of the population, and we all want to be happier mentally. So I think that was also nice to hear that people who don't have a immediate mental health condition might like to benefit from it. And lastly, I would say that anybody who's an ally in any way, and frankly, we are all allies, even me today, while I'm a recipient of so much care, I'm also a giver of allies to many friends who are struggling with depression, and other people in my family who I'm a caregiver of. So I think if you're an ally as a friend, as a colleague, or in any other capacity, I think this book will give you some tips on how you could maybe look at that role better.
One of the things you say right in the introduction is that you believe in holistic therapies. You have identified 7 of them. Can you quickly run through them and explain what it means in a kind of overall context?
Yeah, so when I said holistic, I wanted to look at therapies that were drawn from everyday life and not something that you would necessarily have to, look at that was very specific. So for me, really, the medical therapies is a starting point, and that's drug therapy and psychotherapy, just knowing what those are and whether those are relevant to, your one's condition and what the role that they can play. Love therapy is the role of the family and the caregivers, or not necessarily even family. Anybody who's a caregiver in your life could be love therapy. Then there is the role of the friends and the other networks and the mentors or the community, which I call allies, and the therapy of empathy. And I think this is a really important role that's not always talked about, but has played a very, very critical role in my life in helping me to understand more about myself. Then there is the role of work, which work can, of course, be a huge stressor and has been for me, but work can also be very therapeutic. And if you can, find the right bandwidth in which to work and find the right methodology to work, it's easier said than done, but that's work is an important part of all of our lives. And the workplace, I think, can be a real game changer in terms of having conversations about mental health. So that's because that's where we spend such a large part of our days. Then the conversations that we have with ourself therapy, I did that through journaling, but there are many other ways to understand really what your triggers are, why you're going through what you're going, how can you manage that. So that conversation for me, like, for example, I've had journals for the last 10 years, and looking through them, I've got so much insight about myself. So that's a practice I really recommend. Spiritual therapy, again, some people are inclined, some people are not inclined, but I think some aspects of spiritual therapy, like mindfulness, gratitude, and other notions, are pretty universal and can just help elevate anybody who's dealing with these kind of challenges. And last is lifestyle therapy, which is the idea of sleep, exercise, and nutrition. So the basic point I want to make is that 3 of these therapies for me are what you need to survive, which is really the medical therapy, the role of the caregivers, and then the lifestyle. If these things are not under control, it's hard to really get a handle on the condition. But the others are what you need to go from surviving to thriving. So the role of the allies, the workplace, the conversation with self, and the spiritual therapy. And these are not prescriptive by any means. These are just a template for people to understand what could work for them. Some may be more, some may be less. You don't have to do all 7. 7 sounds like a lot, especially if you're struggling with just the basics. But it's just a kind of a invitation to say, this is what has worked for me. Maybe some of this could, be applicable to you.
Does India have the medical infrastructure to help those with mental illnesses, and specifically bipolar disorder? Awareness, specialized doctors, medicines. Do we have it out there beyond? You live in Mumbai, but do we have it out there in the rest of the country? Do we have the social understanding, family awareness? How do people who may not have access to these things manage?
I think that, it's pretty clear we don't, Sidharth, right? The numbers in terms of this number of psychiatrists the per psychiatrist for how many people they serve is like just absurd numbers. I think there's one for every 2 lakh people or something like that. It's obviously that, the resources in terms of other parts of the country, in terms of rural areas, etc., have been very limited. It's been hard enough living in Mumbai to find the care that I would like, so I can only imagine how much worse it is in other places. But I'm a very like a glass half full kind of person. So I like to see some of the changes that are happening. And I think that possibly because of the pandemic and because pandemic has brought mental health into the forefront, there are many more initiatives that are happening in the not-for-profit as well as the for-profit sector to get people the kind of care that they need. So that is very encouraging. There are a lot more conversations happening, and hopefully the question is, can we then leapfrog a little bit from the path that we earlier would have been on, and use this as an opportunity to actually get to different types of models, and be a little bit more imaginative in the way that we deliver healthcare to the people who need it.
Are there support groups?
So I know for bipolar there is one, for example. I haven't accessed it myself, but I've heard of them. I know that they're doing some good work. I know, for example, in areas like schizophrenia, there's quite a lot of work happening. I know that in areas like addiction things, there are groups that are very active. So it's not that they don't exist. One would probably, need to do a little digging to find things, but they do exist. Yeah.
We'll be right back after this short break.
We know you love fast food,
Fast fashion,
faster payment.
lightning fast internet speed.
Then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Dugirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Wednesday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. How long since if I may ask a rather personal question, how long since you've had some really bad episodes?
Well, actually, the last episode I had was in March 2018, which was for, just over 4 years ago. I don't think it was such a bad one also, but that depends who you ask. My family would think all of them are pretty bad. But I've been pretty okay since then. But what I also don't want to underestimate is that there's a lot of work that goes into keeping me happy and thriving, right? So you can still have lots of daily ups and downs. And it could be anything from, some interpersonal conflict to something related to work-related stress. It could be anything really. And you need to sort of, even managing your daily ups and downs needs a lot of work from all these 7 therapies that I talked about. One day it could be relying on friends. One day it could be looking at exercise. There are different things, that work to keep one stable. So yeah, I'm a work in progress, like all of us.
Finally, the book has been out for a while. You've talked about it quite a lot. People who pick up your book or read an excerpt or know about it, what have been the reactions? And tell me a really out there reaction that warmed your heart.
Well, I got this lovely mail from somebody I never met. He's in his 80s, and his wife, he says, is bipolar and is taking treatment. And then he said, I think my mother was probably bipolar also, and maybe my wife got it from my mother. I'm not quite sure. And then he wrote me this lovely poem. He liked all the poems in the book a lot, and he said, can you please send them to me and compile them and send them to me? I want to refer to them separately. And he wrote a poem for me on the book. So I've had these amazing reactions. And Sidharth, one of the things I must say is I've had, I always thought I'd get interesting reactions from women, because ultimately, this book is by a woman and about a woman as a protagonist. And it's, in the whole area of feelings, which I thought, maybe being gender biased or whatever, but that maybe I'd get a lot of reactions from women, but I'm getting a lot of reactions from men of all ages who are sharing their stories of dealing with mental health conditions and asking for advice in some cases. And, so whether they're writing long letters about what they've been through, or, even sending me a playlist, which was really nice, and talking about how this book would resonate in their lives. So I'm getting nice, interesting reactions from wide range of people.
Any young person who is coping with this strange feeling in her or his head, who feels that your book has opened up doors in their lives?
Yeah, there are a lot of young people, because I'm on Instagram and I'm on LinkedIn, so it's very easy for anybody to get in touch with me.
Aparna, you've done the book. Is it just the conversation is over, or the book just opens up new avenues for you to, because you are a public speaker and educator? What happens next?
Yeah, thanks, Sidharth, for asking that question. So actually, the book is part of a much larger project to try and make a dent of whatever size in the mental health landscape in India, at least by trying to shape the conversation and the dialogue in this space. So because I've been speaking, I really want to engage with companies and raise mental health awareness and doing talks with them, but not just companies. It could be colleges, it could be any other organizations, nonprofits that are interested in having this conversation. So it's really an opportunity to have a dialogue and to share these ideas. Also, at some stage, maybe form communities of people who are looking for help and who want to share their experiences. In the book, we've listed a lot of resources that people can access to get help, but to maybe form a little platform or community where people can share their own lived experiences, either as individuals with a mental health condition or somebody with who's supporting them as an ally or as a caregiver. So I think it's part of a very much longer project that will hopefully have some sort of impact in the way that we think and the way that we speak about mental health in this country.
Will the project also include specialists, experts who will then be available to give advice to people who need help?
I mean, possibly. I don't think we want to necessarily be a provider of mental health services ourselves, but I think if we can form communities, that's a role that doesn't exist as much. The other thing I would love to see, Sidharth, is that if people who are in this space as professionals, like therapists, could, if they find this book interesting, use this in their work. Because again, there's not much literature coming out of India that people can relate to. So, for example, one of my friends who's a therapist has already started using this book in her work with her clients and saying, when it comes to, let's say, accepting a diagnosis, this is what somebody has gone through. You might want to read this. Or when it comes to having a conversation about work, or a conversation about identity, there are different parts of the book that they pick up. And we don't have so much mental health literature. One of the reasons when I was inspired to write this book was a book that I saw that was based in the West, and it was a very different context, and which is why I wanted to do something that was very specific to our context and would be relatable. So I think that would like to use whatever IP and content that we've generated and see how that could actually be helpful to people, and then start maybe building communities around it, and also aligning with any organization that wants to do that with us.
I don't use this word very often. Being a journalist, I'm not supposed to use it. But this was a very, very heartwarming conversation in the sense that I read your book. It opened up not just a new kind of world for me of discovery. I know about mental health. We interviewed a mental health expert about COVID, as well as how it has impacted on people's mental health some months ago. But even so, even given the awareness, it has opened up a lot of thoughts and new thoughts. And you have been extremely candid, surprisingly, about your own experience. And you have been fortunate in some ways, as you have just said, But there may be people out there who probably don't know they have it, or their families know and they don't want to talk about it, or there's no medical infrastructure. And I hope reading this book, listening to this podcast, catching up on some of the support systems that are out there, they confront this situation and get help from society and from their own loved ones. One of the things that you did say in this interview, and you say it in the book most emphatically, is the support of loved ones is crucial in not just coping with, but before that, a step before that, understanding what the situation is, because they too go through a pretty difficult time. They have a hellish kind of a few months and a few years. But ultimately, if they persevere, they come through with it. So thank you very much. That was Aparna Piramal Raje talking about her book, Chemical Khichdi. I wanted to talk about the title, but I think the title is intriguing enough. We should leave it right there. Chemical Khichdi. And I suggest that not just people who may know somebody who suffers from mental health issues, but even others may want to pick it up so that they can approach the subject with some empathy and sensitivity. We'll be back again next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the IVM podcast team, goodbye. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people, and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey. Hello, everybody. It's been another awesome, great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik speaks with actress Aditi Pohankar about the upcoming season 2 of her Netflix series, She. On Capgemini's Techipedia series, Sheila Aditya talks to Ashish Sharma, Senior Director of Automotive India, Capgemini Invent. They discuss the role of electric vehicles in promoting sustainability. On All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk discuss the ongoing negotiations between Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and the Pakistan Army. On Ek Chuski Finance, Priyanka lists down the 7 financial promises every bride and groom must make before getting married. And on the Hansvani, here's the story Mukti. It explores the many social prejudices faced by women. We got some exciting news for you. IVM Podcast has just launched its merch line, and you should check it out now. Head over to the IVM Podcast website, that's ivmpodcast.com, and click on the shop tab to check out our first collection of t-shirts. Also, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. That really does help. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And also do remember, you can check out a number of our shows on YouTube. You can go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube to get a list of the channels that we are keeping active. We also are doing a small listener survey. If you can go to ivmpodcast.com/survey to fill this out, it'll just take a few minutes and it really helps us out. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Apne Liye, Apno Ke Liye. Jupiter, a digital banking app. Capgemini, get the future you want. Intel vPro, built for business. And Intel, future but now wonderful with Intel-powered laptops.